On August 9, 1965, Singapore was unceremoniously kicked out of the Federation of Malaysia, becoming an independent nation completely against its will. This wasn't some glorious victory born from a liberation movement. It was a messy divorce, the bitter outcome of deep, irreconcilable political and ethnic conflicts. Back then, Singapore didn't have a single obvious advantage that would suggest it could survive, let alone thrive. Think about it. No natural resources, no strategic hinterland, no sizable domestic market, and pretty much no military to defend itself. The population was barely 1.9 million people, mostly manual laborers with low skills, high unemployment, and living conditions that would make you wince. Many neighborhoods were still just flimsy shanty towns, thrown together with wood and corrugated iron. The economy's main lifeline? British military bases, but right after independence, the British government announced it was pulling out. Just imagine the sheer panic. Singapore was about to lose its last major economic pillar. Honestly, nobody, and I mean nobody, believed Singapore could last. International observers universally dismissed it as a nation without economic foundations, strategic depth, or any real hope for long-term political stability. In 1965, Singapore's gross domestic product per person hovered around a measly $500 US dollars. In terms of living standards and economic structure, it was essentially a poverty-stricken corner of the developing world, clinging to a medium-sized transit port. Geopolitically, it was a tiny island nation, predominantly Chinese, nestled precariously among much larger Muslim-majority Malay neighbors. The regional atmosphere was tense, full of distrust, and bubbling with security risks. Public assessments from that era were brutal. Many international organizations and media outlets predicted Singapore's independent existence would be short-lived. Some even suggested the economy would collapse within a few years. Even the British, their former colonial masters, were deeply skeptical about this new nation's chances. Bankruptcy, social unrest, and a perpetual reliance on foreign aid were seen as the most likely outcomes. Put simply, by almost every economic, political, and security metric in 1965, Singapore was a complete non-starter. This, my friends, is the actual starting point of the Singapore story. But there was one tiny detail that most of the world either missed or severely underestimated. Singapore wasn't just some random port attached to a slum. It sat right at the doorstep of one of the planet's most critical maritime arteries, the Strait of Malacca. This is where a massive chunk of global sea trade funnels through. Now, this prime location didn't magically create wealth, but it handed Singapore a potent wildcard. If they played it right, it could be their ticket to survival. Singapore didn't create global trade routes. They simply positioned themselves perfectly and slowly but surely transformed into a place that anyone passing by would need to stop at. Think fuel, repairs, transshipment, finance, insurance, logistics. That port wasn't just a decorative feature, it was the quiet, unassuming genesis of their entire survival narrative. Fast forward almost 6 decades since that unlikely independence, and Singapore has achieved a status that's, well, nothing short of astonishing. Its gross domestic product per person has now soared past $80,000 US dollars, outperforming even the United Kingdom, its former colonial ruler, and even the United States. Singapore boasts one of the busiest and most efficient airports globally, and an airline that consistently ranks among the world's best. Its education system is top tier, and its military, while small, is organized and equipped far beyond what its population size would suggest. This incredible transformation begs the central question: how did a nation starting from such a weak position achieve such growth and stability within just one generation? The answer, as we'll see, isn't found in feel-good slogans or soft solutions. Singapore's case highlights the decisive role of state power, strict social discipline, and highly directive policy choices. Let's dive right into the thick of it. Part 1. The Benevolent Dictatorship. Simply put, Singapore decided to trade a chunk of individual freedom for order, economic growth, and stability. You can't talk about Singapore without acknowledging the sheer toughness, even harshness, with which its leaders wielded state power. In the traditional Western political thought, individual liberty is often the central value, the litmus test for a regime's legitimacy. This model champions competitive elections, expansive free speech, and a deep-seated belief that markets and civil society will naturally self-correct any deviations. Singapore, however, in its early nation-building years, chose a starkly different path, prioritizing economic growth and social order over expanding political freedoms. To really grasp Singapore's economic miracle, you need to understand the People's Action Party, or the PAP, led by Lee Kuan Yew. He wasn't interested in being a politician in the usual sense. He ran the country like the chief executive officer of a cash-strapped startup. And much like a no-nonsense CEO, he believed democracy was a luxury, something you only worried about once people weren't starving anymore. Lee Kuan Yew championed an ideology often criticized by Western critics, but which delivered undeniable benefits to Singapore's economic development. He called them Asian values. The core argument was pretty direct. The community's interests must come before those of any single individual. Order, he argued, was more important than freedom. So, as a citizen, you accepted giving up some of your rights, like the right to protest, the right to form disruptive labor unions, even the right to chew gum. In return, the government promised you a job, a roof over your head, and safety. It was a social contract forged in iron, tough, clear, and non-negotiable. And this is where the story gets really interesting. This is also where most dictatorships around the world crash and burn. In many cases, when power gets concentrated in one person or a small group, the usual fallout is rampant corruption, nepotism, and a steady erosion of fiscal discipline. Lee Kuan Yew took a different route. He made building an honest and disciplined state apparatus a strategic priority from day one. In the 1960s, corruption was as common as humidity across much of Southeast Asia, and in many places it still persists today. Need a license? Bribe. Want the police to investigate a crime? Bribe. Need your water supply hooked up? You guessed it, bribe. Corruption acted like a monstrous hidden tax on businesses. Foreign investors absolutely loathed it because it was both expensive and utterly unpredictable. So, Singapore established the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or CPIB, and gave it real teeth. And by teeth, I mean shark teeth. Sharp, pointy, and merciless. The CPIB reports directly to the Prime Minister and has the authority to investigate and arrest without needing to go through endless bureaucratic layers. They can check your bank accounts, your spouse's accounts, and even your mistress's accounts. The rules of the game were refreshingly simple. If your lifestyle far exceeded your declared income and you couldn't reasonably explain it, you were automatically presumed to be up to no good. The following case isn't just a story. It shows these anti-corruption measures weren't just pretty words on paper. In 1986, a situation involving a senior cabinet member became a crucial test for the entire system. Teh Cheang Wan was the Minister for National Development, part of the first generation of leaders who helped build Singapore's foundational institutions. He held an incredibly influential position and was well respected. But the CPIB received a tip-off that he had accepted bribes totaling what would be about $800,000 in today's money to help a property developer keep a piece of land. In most other countries, a figure like that would get a slap on the wrist, or the investigation would quietly vanish into thin air. But in Singapore, the CPIB interrogated him for a grueling 16 hours straight. During the investigation, Teh Cheang Wan tried to contact Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, requesting a meeting. That request was flatly denied. Days later, on the morning he was due to appear in court to face the charges, Teh Cheang Wan was found dead at his home, having overdosed on a mito. He left a suicide note addressed to Lee Kuan Yew, mentioning his mental breakdown leading up to his death. In the letter, Tay Chang-wan wrote that he felt he deserved a severe punishment for his wrongdoings. Lee Kuan Yew then made the full letter public in Parliament. This public handling of the case sent an unmistakable message about Singapore's commitment to integrity within its government, even when the person involved was a high-ranking official. For international investors, this incident reinforced their trust that Singapore's anti-corruption regulations were enforced consistently, without fear or favour. But punishment alone isn't enough. You also need incentives to reduce the motivation for corruption in the first place. Lee Kuan Yew argued that if civil servants' salaries were too low compared to the private sector, the public service would struggle to attract and retain competent people, simultaneously increasing the risk of corruption. So, Singapore made the audacious choice to link the salaries of its public officials to private sector income levels. Under this system, the head of Singapore's government currently earns around $1.6 million US per year. That's significantly higher than what many other heads of state make, including the President of the United States. For Singapore, this isn't about image or privilege, it's a design feature, part of the system engineered to compete for top talent with the private sector. High remuneration is expected to reduce the incentive for corruption while attracting genuinely capable individuals, engineers, economists, scholars, into public service. In practice, international assessments consistently rank Singapore among the least corrupt countries in the world, proving that this mechanism has worked pretty well. It's arguably the only Asian nation that consistently maintains this position, rubbing shoulders with Nordic countries like Scandinavia. This stability and reliability gradually became a national product for Singapore, especially in a region often grappling with political instability and extra-legal interference. Singapore is perceived as an environment with high institutional stability and strong asset protection. This factor became a critical advantage in attracting foreign investment and long-term economic activities. Part 2. Open Door Strategy for Growth. A clean government only creates the institutional bedrock. To truly improve living standards, the economy needed to generate income and jobs. This required clearly identifying the resources that could be brought to the market. With its glaring lack of natural resources and a tiny domestic market, Singapore pinpointed its people, its labour force, as the primary resource for development. However, this choice immediately threw up a massive challenge concerning the capabilities and skills of that workforce. Singapore's central hurdle back then was to upgrade a labour force primarily engaged in simple, unskilled jobs into human capital capable of participating in industrial and technological production. From this realization, Singapore embarked on an economic path that diverged sharply from many other developing nations of its time. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, many newly independent countries chose a development model based on economic nationalism. This strategy emphasized limiting the role of foreign capital, nationalizing key industries, and building domestic industry through protectionist policies. That approach was called import substitution, and it was all the rage in Latin America, Africa, and even Singapore's immediate neighbors. Singapore looked at this path and shrewdly understood that it might satisfy national pride, but it would absolutely decimate their wallets. Lee Kuan Yew and his brilliant economic architect, Swee, grasped a harsh truth. Back then, Singaporeans barely knew how to make anything. They had no technology, no capital, and no domestic market large enough to cushion them. The brutal reality was that Singapore simply couldn't industrialize in the traditional way. Its small population, limited production capacity, and lack of capital meant that domestic manufacturing costs would be sky-high, while consumption capacity would remain low. Facing this stark reality, Singapore opted for a radical open-door strategy and established the Economic Development Board, or EDB, specifically to attract foreign direct investment. This was a decision born from weakness, not from existing advantages. This decision also happened to coincide perfectly with a period when the global economy was entering a phase of manufacturing globalization. The widespread adoption of containerization drastically reduced sea freight costs, while multinational corporations began to decentralize their production operations to lower-cost locations. Singapore didn't create this trend, but it was one of the very few nations ready to adjust its policies immediately and plug directly into global supply chains. The EDB's mission then was to fly all over the United States, Europe and Japan, knocking on the doors of every major corporation, begging them to set up factories in Singapore, especially in assembly and industrial manufacturing. Try to imagine a sales pitch in 1968. You walk into the boardroom of Texas Instruments or Hewlett-Packard. You unroll a map, and they can't even find your country on it. Then you tell them, come build a semiconductor factory in this swampy, hot, mosquito-infested place, where your neighbors might attack you at any moment. But hey, the labor's cheap and the workers won't go on strike. That was a tough sell, to put it mildly. To offset these disadvantages of size and the volatile regional environment, Singapore offered incredibly aggressive investment incentives. These included pioneer status for companies, granting them 5 to 10 years of tax exemptions, a rock-solid commitment to policy stability, a disciplined workforce, and strict limits on strikes. While many nations at the time were nationalizing foreign assets, Singapore actively created the most favorable conditions possible for international corporations to operate and profit there. Singapore built the Jurong Industrial Estate as a cornerstone of its outward-looking industrialization strategy. In its early days, it was a genuine disaster. Critics sarcastically called it Go Keng Swee's folly, or the government's madness, because it was just empty factories in the middle of nowhere. The area struggled with a lack of investors and low utilization capacity. Then in 1968, Texas Instruments was looking to move its assembly operations overseas to cut costs, weighing options like Hong Kong and Taiwan. EDB officials from Singapore pursued TI's management with relentless tenacity. Singapore promised they could get a factory up and running in just 50 days. Texas Instruments probably thought that was an outrageous boast. Singapore responded with action. To deliver on this commitment, the government slashed unnecessary administrative red tape and mobilized resources to work around the clock. The result? Texas Instruments factory in Singapore was operational in roughly 50 days. After this success, other industrial giants like Hewlett-Packard, General Electric, and various Japanese companies soon followed, investing in Singapore. By the 1970s, the nation became a crucial hub in the production and export of data storage devices. During this period, Singapore wasn't focused on inventing new technologies or groundbreaking research. Instead, it immersed itself in assembly and manufacturing, thereby absorbing production processes, technical standards, and industrial management skills. This was arguably their most brilliant move. Singapore didn't try to reinvent the wheel. Singapore let the Americans bring the wheels, the factories, and even the blueprints. Singaporeans' job was simply to learn how to produce everything better, faster, and more efficiently than anyone else. Through collaboration with foreign corporations, Singapore gained direct access to proven technologies, processes, and organizational models. The local workforce concentrated on boosting productivity, improving quality, and optimizing operational efficiency. While many developing nations opted for strategies less integrated with international trade, Singapore rapidly and deeply embedded itself into global supply chains. When the economic interests of major corporations and powerful nations became tied to Singapore's stability, the political and economic costs of destabilizing this small nation also increased dramatically. Part 3. Public housing and the role of the HDB. Even though economic growth created jobs in the early years after independence, most Singaporeans still lived in makeshift homes with truly appalling living conditions. These temporary settlements posed numerous risks related to safety, public health, and social order. In the context of the Cold War, the Singaporean government also worried that precarious living conditions could create fertile ground for the growth of opposing political movements. To maintain a stable workforce and ensure social order, the government viewed solving the housing problem as a strategic priority. From there, the Housing and Development Board, or HDB, was given a central role. In many Western countries, social housing is often associated with poverty and urban management issues. In contrast, in Singapore, public housing was designed to meet relatively high living standards and became the popular choice for the majority of the population. Today, roughly 80% of Singapore's population lives in apartments developed by the HDB, with some of these units even trading at very high prices on the resale market. However, this public housing system was born out of extremely difficult initial circumstances. In 1961, a massive fire swept through the Bukit Swee squatter settlement, leaving approximately 16,000 people homeless in just a few hours. It was a tragedy that underscored the dire housing crisis. This event put urgent pressure on the Singaporean government to address urban housing. After the fire, Kuan famously committed to rehousing all those affected within 1 year, a promise that was remarkably kept. However, the government didn't choose to rebuild temporary shacks. Instead, it embarked on constructing high-rise concrete apartment blocks and implementing a long-term home ownership model. This reflected the Singaporean leadership's view that home ownership could tie the economic interests of its citizens to the overall stability of society. Through long-term leases, often up to 99 years, residents became stakeholders with a direct interest in the stability of the property market and the economy as a whole. This helped mitigate risks of social unrest and created a populace inclined to support the existing order. But the obvious question is, where would poor people get the money to buy these homes? The solution Singapore chose was to build a mandatory state-managed savings mechanism. Singapore expanded its Central Provident Fund, or CPF, as a compulsory savings tool. Under this system, a significant percentage of a worker's salary, currently, contributions from both employees and employers can total around 37%, is channeled directly into the fund before net income is paid out. The money in your CPF couldn't be withdrawn for short-term consumption. You couldn't pull it out for a fancy dinner, a weekend trip, or even a beer. But you were allowed to use it for long-term purposes like purchasing HDB housing, healthcare, and retirement. Through this, the state steered people's financial behavior towards saving and accumulation. The government basically took your money, used it to build houses, and then sold those houses back to you with your own money. This loop felt protective, even paternalistic, but it operated with astonishing effectiveness. Thanks to these policies, Singapore achieved one of the highest home ownership rates in the world, nearing 90%. However, the nation's public housing system is also intertwined with another, more controversial, social policy. Given that Singapore is a multi-ethnic society, with a Chinese majority alongside Malay and Indian communities, the 1960s saw several severe ethnic riots. Residential communities tended to cluster along ethnic lines, increasing the risk of social division. Against this backdrop, by 1989, the Singaporean government implemented a policy aimed at limiting ethnic segregation in residential areas. This policy, known as the Ethnic Integration Policy, EIP, applied an ethnic quota system to each apartment block. When the proportion of one ethnic group in a building reached a prescribed ceiling, further transactions by members of that same group would be restricted. In some cases, apartment sellers were compelled to prioritize transactions with buyers from a different ethnic group to comply with the quota. This meant the state directly intervened in the housing market to shape demographic composition. The policy's goal was simple: to compel different ethnic groups to live together, share common infrastructure, and use public spaces. The idea was straightforward. It's hard to hate people when you live right next door to them. Regular daily contact was expected to reduce ethnic tensions and prevent the recurrence of past conflicts. This policy is often seen as one of the clearest examples of Singapore's governing philosophy, where the state prioritizes technical measures to maintain social stability, even if it curtails individual freedom of choice. Part 4. Language Policy and the Choice of English in Education. To understand why Singapore achieved such a high degree of economic integration while many other Asian nations struggled, we need to look at how this country tackled the language problem. In the 1960s, most Singaporeans spoke various Chinese dialects like Hokkien, Cantonese, and Teochew, alongside Malay and Tamil. English at that time was primarily used within the colonial administration. In the post-colonial era, many nations opted to discard the language of the former colonial power to consolidate national identity. However, Singapore's leaders pragmatically assessed that retaining English could offer a practical advantage in international economic and trade relations. The core argument for this policy was simple. English had already become the common working language in global commerce, finance, and technology. While local dialects had cultural value, they wouldn't effectively connect Singapore to international economic centers. Adopting English as the primary language of instruction throughout the entire education system met with significant social resistance. Yet the government implemented this policy consistently, viewing it as a necessary condition for building a workforce capable of directly participating in the global economy. You might want your child to study Confucian classics and ancient scriptures, but the state said nope. Under the new policy, English became the language for teaching core subjects like mathematics and science, while mother tongues were taught as separate subjects. This approach allowed Singapore to maintain its capacity for international integration while preserving basic cultural elements. If you couldn't speak English, your kids wouldn't get jobs. The Singaporean government identified English proficiency as a key requirement for participating in the modern labour market. In the process of implementing this policy, Chinese medium universities, including Nanyang University, were either closed or merged into the English medium education system. This decision provoked strong social reactions and was later acknowledged by Kuan as one of his most difficult political and personal choices, given its direct impact on a significant segment of his supportive electorate. 3 decades later, when the internet boom hit and the digital economy and global banking sectors grew exponentially, Singapore already had a workforce ready and able to work directly in international environments. While Japan and China had to spend billions of dollars on translators and still struggled with language barriers, a Singaporean engineer could pick up the phone and troubleshoot an issue directly with a colleague in Silicon Valley in real time. This advantage significantly reduced communication costs and barriers for Singapore compared to many other large economies in the region, where businesses still heavily rely on translation systems and linguistic intermediaries for global operations. The result was a Singaporean workforce that combined discipline, high savings rates, and an Asian cultural foundation with the ability to use English as its primary working language. This allowed the nation to effectively serve as an intermediary in the flows of trade, finance, and technology between East Asia and Western economic centers.